So Dr. Gaines is a graduate of Harvard. You did your BA in physics and chemistry.
Right.
And then you did your PhD at Columbia in physics.
Right.
And now you are a systems analyst here at Argonne.
Yeah, we kind of made that time off.
Yeah, so what is this systems analyst title really mean?
Well, the basic idea is we're doing all kinds of scientific research to demonstrate different energy production technologies. But the question is, which ones make the most sense? And so you've got to actually look at all the factors involved. I mean, the most obvious ones are sort of process efficiency and cost. But then it turns out there are all kinds of other things that come into it that you might not have thought of. And everything from political things to regulatory things to national security kinds of things. So you may have a really good technology, but it turns out it relies on a material that's only produced in one country that's not really friendly. And so that comes into it. The questions that we ask are, how can you evaluate these different technologies in the real world?
How did you get specifically into this transportation sector for electric vehicles, et cetera?
Kind of indirectly. I mean, I started out in chemical physics looking at spectra in the laboratory of molecules that my thesis advisor wanted to find in the interstellar medium. So he had discovered formaldehyde in space and things like that. And so I was measuring the microwave spectra so that he could see whether those frequencies appeared in clouds in space. And then my husband and I both finished our PhD work. He's a high-energy physicist, and we needed to get 2 jobs in the same location, which is always amusing. And one of the obvious places for a high-energy physicist was Fermilab. So I was looking in the Chicago area, and I went to see somebody at the University of Chicago who was doing molecular spectroscopy. And he liked what I was doing, and I liked what he was doing, but he didn't have any money to do that. So I was leaving his office, and he had a flow chart up on the door, and it was how you make an automobile from raw materials in the ground. And I looked at that and said, oh, that's interesting. He said, oh, I have money to do that. You want a job? So I worked. Sure. So I worked for him for a year and a half, and actually what we did was we looked at the total social costs of coal and nuclear power.
Okay.
And we even wrote a book. I've got several copies over there if you want to see our book. It sold about 4 copies, and we got 35 cents in royalties. It was great. And after about a year and a half, he said, well, why don't you go get a real job and work for my friend Joe at Argonne?
Oh.
So I moved to work for his friend Joe at Argonne. I got here and we started doing a series of studies that were called Energy and Materials Flows in the Production of Blank. And you fill in your energy-intensive materials. So we looked at copper and plastics and iron and steel and that sort of stuff. And that, that's an obvious good basis for transportation. So we were comparing aluminum and steel for vehicles and which ones, it takes more energy to make the aluminum, but then the car is lighter and it uses less fuel. So trade-offs like that.
Well, it's fascinating because a lot of us as consumers don't really consider a lot of the social consequences of what we're buying, right? We only think of, we'll think of energy efficiency and stuff, but we don't necessarily think of the source of all the raw materials.
Right, and when you're thinking about cars, for instance, you think about electric cars. They don't use any petroleum now. It's great, but there are lots of different materials that you need to make the batteries and the cars, and you've got to look and see what the impacts are from making those things and where they're made. And for instance, one of the materials in electric vehicle batteries is cobalt, and cobalt comes from the Congo, and the Congo is not a friendly place, and they're not very kind to children who are going down the mines and mining the cobalt. So, that kind of thing comes into the studies.
And this is exactly why I actually wanted to bring your expertise. That's along the lines of what my thesis work is on, which is related to lithium-ion battery recycling, and you are just right down that alley of doing the work that researches the whole cycle of where it comes from, how it's made, etc. And then you're also part of the ReCell program here, right?
We'd actually been scoping out the battery recycling area for the Department of Energy for about 10 years, and we finally convinced them that this was a very important topic.
10 years.
10 years. All of the focus had been on battery materials and how you get the most efficient cathode materials and how you manufacture the battery and how you make them last longer. And it was only after these batteries had been in service for a while and some of them started coming back that people were seriously concerned about what you're going to do with these at the end of their life. We had been scoping out the different battery recycling processes and trying to understand what was available. And about a year and a half ago, the Department of Energy put out a lab call, which is sort of a request for proposals among the national laboratories to look for ways to recycle these batteries. And this is a $15 million 3-year project, which Argonne won with our lab partners, NREL and Oak Ridge. And for the last about a year, we've been actually setting up labs and starting different experiments to understand what the best recycling processes will be. And we're specifically aiming at ones that recover cathode material in usable form rather than breaking it down into the individual elements.
So like a direct recycling.
Yeah, we call that direct recycling. And the basic reason for that is that although many of the electronics batteries were highly cobalt intensive, and cobalt is expensive, so if you recycle the battery to get the cobalt back, it can be economical. The biggest push lately in transportation has been to go to low cobalt batteries for a number of reasons, one of which is cost, another is the human elements that we talked about a little before. And there are also performance questions, and so there's a big push to move away from cobalt towards nickel and some manganese as well. And so if you have less expensive elements that you're recovering when you recover just elements, it makes the battery cheaper, but it also means that you get less back when you want to recycle it. But if you can actually recover the structure of the cathode material, which has value in itself, then maybe you can actually get an economical recycling process. And that's really the aim of the center, the ReCell Center, which is to actually come up with an economically feasible battery recycling process.
So ReCell also has that Everbat. Is that the software that comes?
Yeah, once you actually develop a process for doing something, you need to vet it and actually evaluate it from a standpoint of, is it really energy efficient? What are the environmental impacts of this process? And most important from a business standpoint is this going to be an economical process? And so we've developed this model called Everbat, which then looks at all of those factors for the different battery recycling processes.
We have used that actually in our lab. It's been really useful in like a very good economic and environmental sort of way, to evaluate a process, which has been
The
fun.
tricky bit is getting the right data to put into it.
Yeah.
And in particular, in this area, because these are things in the research stage, and also things that in some cases are proprietary to specific companies,
Right.
getting good data for an appropriate scale that you might want to use commercially is extremely tricky. And so the way you get around that is you try to do sensitivity analysis, and you kind of beg companies for data, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
I mean, it's just incredible that you started as, a more general physicist chemist and went into this field like specifically related to the transportation and electric vehicle sector. Did you always know that you were going to be a scientist like this?
I knew I would be a scientist. And starting back in 10th grade when we first learned about the periodic table, and I saw how neatly everything fit together.
Yeah, wasn't that wonderful?
That was just totally cool, and it was clearly what I wanted to, the direction I wanted to go.
Was there a role model in your life that helped guide you to that?
No. I was actually thinking about that, and I've tried really hard to come up with somebody who served as a role model, and I don't think I can.
You're a pioneer in your own right, which is why it's...
I guess. But I mean, there certainly was one woman physics professor at Columbia, but she was just there. She was, as far as I could tell, not mentoring women in particular, and gender was just not an issue. And mostly I didn't see it as an issue in grad school, with a couple of sort of exceptions, in particular the machine shop. I would be designing parts for our maser spectrometer, and I would take the designs down to the machine shop and say, can you make this? And it turned out if there was something with really tight specifications, I could always get them to agree to make it, but they would never tell me there was something they couldn't do. But if one of the guys in the lab took it down, it was too hard. Similarly, if I went in to do something, all the guys would come and try to help me during business hours, which was why I tended to use the machines not during business hours. So there were sort of subtle advantages, but there were also, I think, disadvantages as well. I did have a symbiotic relationship with one of the other students. He was a big guy. We were doing a lot of waveguide experiments, and we had a little teeny tiny waveguide which I could screw together and Ken couldn't. And then we had big heavy waveguide that I couldn't hold up. So he would hold it up and I would screw things together, and it worked really well.
That's kind of exactly the synergy that I think more of the fields, and not just science, but even feminine, heavy fields could use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no point in denying physical differences, but both men and women are essentially capable of all of the same things.
I remember in, I think, some of the slides you did with the WIST, the Women in Science and Technology presentation, you mentioned that your mother was a teacher, but that wasn't...
No, she wanted me to be a teacher.
Oh, okay.
She thought that being a teacher would be a good job for a woman, because you could be home when your kids got home from school and you had the summers off.
Interesting. And of course you're like, not for me, Mom.
Well, the thing about being a teacher is I didn't really want to go to school for 20 years to learn stuff that I was going to then regurgitate to a new set of students. I wanted to do something new. I wanted to, add to human knowledge, if you want to put it in a really sort of trivial sounding.
Yeah,
one of the professors at Columbia always used to greet people in the morning by saying, "How are we doing today? Are we pushing back the frontiers of human knowledge?"
Oh, that's incredible. To start a morning like that.
Yeah, he was a little weird.
Aren't all of those professors?
Yeah, come to think of it, they were all weird.
In terms of your career from going as a student, an undergrad student, to a grad student, did you know that you wanted to do grad school?
That was fairly clear pretty early on. Essentially, if you just get an undergraduate degree or even a master's, you're doing what somebody else is telling you to do.
That's true.
If you want to figure out what to do and do it yourself, or tell somebody else to do it, then you need to have a PhD, at least in physics. Now, that may not be true in all of the engineering fields, but that was the impression I got when I was deciding whether to go to grad school or not. So it was not an issue.
How did you decide specifically on the physics side? Well, I know you said the chemistry side was originally...
Oh, well, that was actually kind of a funny funny way because I started out as a chemistry major.
Right.
And I guess it was junior year I had a choice of taking the quantum mechanics course in the chemistry department, which was complicated molecular orbital calculations and stuff like that, or the one in the physics department, which was much more theoretical and elegant and was taught by a really cool Nobel Prize winning guy. So that was a fairly obvious choice, and the thing that really made it a no-brainer choice was that the chemistry department course met at the same time as another course I wanted to take, which was string quartets of Haydn and Mozart.
Amazing.
So I took the Haydn and Mozart course and the physics department course, and that meant that I was changing majors from chemistry to chemistry and physics, which is a cool major in that you don't need enough courses to major in either one, and you don't have to write a thesis and you still get honors. It's a great
Win-win.
major.
And you get to take your string quartet course.
Right.
So you play an instrument then?
I
also.
used to play the violin really badly. I actually gave it up freshman year because I figured out that I was just way above my class, and I concentrated on being in the chorus. And so I've been singing in a chorus
Still
forever.
today?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
There's an Argonne chorus.
Oh.
The Argonne chorus puts on a spring concert and a holiday concert. So we're rehearsing already for this holiday season.
How exciting! And it'll be there will be performances here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually we perform in 362 Auditorium and sometimes 402, and occasionally we will do divisional Christmas parties if requested nicely.
That's something also that I respect a lot when I hear people that are highly technical. They have a life outside of science, and so for you, it's a musical sort of talent.
Well, music is actually in a way very scientific,
Yeah.
and so it's always been something that I enjoyed. My parents started taking me to concerts when I was about 10. So I got to like classical music.
Do you think it really actually enhanced what you do as a scientist? Because I know music has that rhythm, the beats, and it's basically algorithms. And if you look at,
It's
I know
highly
parts of
organized.
Mozart's, yeah,
Yeah.
works and stuff.
Certainly uses a lot of the same skills. So it's hard to know because I didn't do a controlled experiment, right?
You can do that, on the side. That's the next thing. Speaking of the next thing, what do you think is the next thing for you at Argonne?
I'm somewhat overwhelmed by having, a large project rather than kind of hiding in the corner with a little teeny tiny project. So we're just finally getting up to speed on the center, and that obviously I'm going to follow through for the 3 years that it's scheduled. We've already heard that it's more likely to be 5.
I see. Did it start? The 3 years started last year?
The project was actually announced by Secretary Perry in January of this year.
Okay.
We had actually started at the beginning of the fiscal year, which was really frustrating because we knew we were doing it and we weren't allowed to tell anybody.
Oh,
Because it hadn't been announced, right? And it kept being, they're going to announce it next week at such and such, and kept not happening. Finally got officially announced in January.
And that was also announced with the DOE battery recycling competition. Was that in parallel?
It was in parallel, and I think that was partly our fault in the sense that we had already been designing a research program that had to do with what you do with the material once you get it back. We had a big meeting with industry at NREL a few months before everything was announced, and it was very clear that there was also a lot of concern and work that needed to be done about getting the batteries back, actually gathering them together and sorting them and that sort of thing. And since that was not part of our project as outlined, DOE decided that they would add this additional money in to look at actually getting the batteries back so that we could do our thing with them.
Oh, I see.
So
There's a whole strategy.
Yeah, so the prize is more on the gathering together side
The
of it.
logistics.
And that's $5 million in 3 phases. And they've now given out, I think, 15 $67,000 grants to develop ideas for the front end.
What do you think is the greatest challenge with, obviously there's a challenge within your own research, which is the separation technology and all that stuff, but the logistics of gathering for the physical parts to the center?
I don't think that's as much of a problem for the electric vehicle batteries, but for electronics batteries, it's a real challenge. The batteries are in lots and lots of devices. Probably a bunch of them are in your drawer right now. So you probably have some old phones and old calculators and things. So just getting those back, and in addition to worrying about getting them back, there's a question of whether they're going overseas. So if you take your iPhone back to Apple and get a new one, what do they do with the old one? They may be selling it off to second users in India or Poland or somewhere, and then there's what happens to those at the end of their life? Are they going to be getting back somewhere for recycling? So there are all kinds of logistics problems for that. Not to mention technical problems, because they are in so many different devices and they're embedded in them, and they may be glued in, and they may be really
There's
small.
a lot of other materials
and there's
built in, yeah.
And there's a lot. So
Or proprietary things inside
right.
of it too.
And I know Apple has demonstrated robotic disassembly of their phones.
The Daisy, I heard, yeah.
Well, first there was Liam, and then there was the new and better one. And if you actually look at the rate, one of these I think it's 200 cell phones an hour can be disassembled. If you think about how many robots that would mean for disassembling the millions and millions of phones, it's not going to be economical. I think they're demonstrating it to show it can be done, but I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Do you see the future of the battery recycling being in the hands of, some companies that do it, or the government is going to have a huge center, or like each, only the larger corporations, or? And
So
who owns it too? Like, who owns the battery once it's dead?
Yeah, hard questions. I mean, if you look at your cell phone, you own the cell phone, you own the battery. You're responsible for getting rid of your garbage.
And then once it hits the landfill, and
You don't want
it's
it
so
to hit
weird.
the landfill.
Right.
Well, there are two problems. One is there have been problems with fires from batteries in landfills. And the other is this is valuable materials that you really don't want to be throwing away.
Yeah.
So the question is how to best capture them and do it economically. In the U.S., I tend to see that as a business function of some set of companies, but that's why we're trying to make it an economical process so that there will be some incentive for businesses to do it.
There's a Swedish study that came out, maybe I can send it to you later, but it was saying that the rates of recycling are actually higher than we think they are. There's a statistic going around that it's less than 5%.
This is Hans-Eric Mellon.
Yes.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I'm not sure what he's talking about. He may also be talking about home scrap and rather than post-consumer scrap. He's got a number of interesting graphs which basically show this is how many batteries are going out of service, but this is how many fewer are available for recycling. So I'm not sure whether that's because they're being exported and therefore not available in the U.S. or Sweden or wherever, or whether whether he's considering them unavailable for some other reason.
But it's interesting that it's a field that's exploding. I think recently I've just been seeing article after article now that are coming out. I think.
Yeah, I don't know how you get a critical mass, but obviously we did.
Yeah. Well, I think DOE probably had a major, if DOE is looking at it, that's a major push for a lot of agencies and
But
schools.
also, if you look at when the first electric vehicles actually hit the market,
2008?
No,
Earlier.
Yeah, and well.
That was the first Tesla probably.
The Teslas and the Volts and the Leafs are just starting to get to the end of their warranty periods.
Right.
So I don't know whether they're all going out of service. I think a lot of the cars are still being used, but it's reached people's consciousness that these are going to be coming out of service, and we need to do something about it.
What do you think is going to be the groundbreaking change or the next big technology to combat this?
To address the recycling issue? I don't know. I hope that our processes will do it. That would be a good solution. There is commercial recycling in China and also Korea on fairly large scale, but they're breaking the molecules down into smaller pieces. And
I see they're doing like the hydro.
they're doing hydrometallurgical recycling. The only place that I think pyrometallurgy is being done on a large scale is in Belgium.
Oh, with Unicorn.
Unicorn, yeah.
Gotcha. They're a mining company, right? So that was kind of a borrowed process.
Right, and their big thing is recovering of precious metals from various waste streams. I visited their big smelter, and there's a huge smelter that's basically a copper smelter, but the copper is the byproduct. The precious metals that they get out are really the economic product.
So since you said you were in Belgium to see that, you've been able to travel to all these different places and
We've been pretty lucky about doing site visits. Most of the plants in China, my colleague Cheng Dai, who's a couple of offices down, has gotten to see those.
I met her. She was at the Baker Institute rice thing. There's a workshop for minerals and energy, and I think she was one of the representatives for Argonne's ReCell.
She's the one who's basically developing the Ecobat model.
Okay, yeah, she's great. I love that.
And it's a big advantage to us to have a native Chinese speaker visiting the Chinese plants, because otherwise we would be relying on translators and not necessarily get as much information.
Well, that's wonderful. That was a good benefit of diversity in people and ethnicity as well. I never thought of that being, really key asset.
In Michael Wang's group, which she and I are both part of, that's actually a significant asset for a lot of the work, because there's a lot of U.S.-China stuff going on with DOE, and so we've had several people coming in from China, and several staff members have gone back.
That's amazing. So there's a lot of different collaborations, across nations and everything. What's the coolest place that you'd say you've been?
Well, we did just get back from Egypt.
Oh, that's right.
Although calling it cool when it was 105 in Aswan is figurative rather than literal. All of the ancient stuff is totally amazing, and Egypt was leading the way then, and if you look at Egypt today, it's not leading the way, and there's so many things they need to do
to really tidy up.
To bring...
The engineer in you is screaming, use solar!
Yeah, use solar, irrigate stuff, pick up the damn garbage. There's still so much potential there. There's so many people who are underemployed, but they do have major resources. The river is, what they say is the river is life, and it really is. It's a huge resource, and the sun is a huge resource, and
there's a lot of potential.
There's a lot of untapped potential. But it's a fascinating place to visit, and the message that we got from their top archaeologist and the head of antiquities and Mrs. Sadat, whom we had tea with in her house.
Amazing.
Totally. Is Egypt is safe. It's still fascinating. Come visit. They get a lot of their revenue from tourism, and it has suffered since the revolution, or whatever it was you want to call it, that they had in 2011. And it's still not back fully. So they're making sure it's safe by literally having armed escorts for all of the tourists, all the major tour companies.
Wow.
So we certainly never felt unsafe at all, and we were taken care of really well as far as having safe water and food that was washed appropriately.
Well, it just goes to say how much, I think traveling really to some place totally different makes people appreciate the modern technologies and the amenities that we have that truly are luxuries.
Yeah, although I have to say we had all of the luxuries from the time we arrived.
Yeah.
We started out in a 5-star hotel with pyramid view.
Oh my word.
It's totally,
You just transported yourself back to the BC.
What you don't realize is that, you envision the pyramids being off in the desert somewhere.
Yeah, I kind of did.
The city has come right to the pyramids, and in fact, the hotshot archaeologist that spoke to us several times made it a point that he personally had seen to it that there was this wall that was put up, and there was a soccer field and some houses that were on the wrong side of the wall, and they were removed.
Wow.
So now there's a wall around the Giza Plateau, but still, I can show you some pictures. The city comes right up to that wall.
That's incredible.
And from there we went to a cruise ship on the Nile, which was also essentially a 5-star hotel. And when
Did you feel like a pharaoh? on the
Not
sea?
quite. And then when we got back to Cairo, we were in a different 5-star hotel, which was the Four Seasons, overlooking the park and right around the corner from where Mrs. Sadat lives.
Wow, that's
So
incredible.
it's, but the contrasts between the good neighborhoods and the not good neighborhoods in Cairo are
Stark.
huge, really stark.
I'm sure you went inside of the pyramids and things like that while you were there.
That was so weird. I think my favorite was the tombs of the workers. Right near the Valley of the Kings, there's a village that was inhabited by the people who painted the tombs and did whatever other building you needed to do to build these tombs in the mountain. And they had their own tombs. And you could climb down into their tombs, and they were painted much less expertly and with much sort of homier kinds of pictures of Egyptian gods and things. And this is stuff that was built 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's like surreal.
Yeah.
I would love to go. It's on the list then, but not during the summer.
But no. And the other thing I would advise you about the Great Pyramid is, if you are going in it, try to get some time when it's closed to the public, because you have to climb up 2 very narrow passages, one of which you have to bend down the whole time you're climbing up.
Oh, they were much smaller people then.
I think it was meant to be somewhere where you couldn't stand up.
I gotcha.
Yeah. And then there's another fairly steep ramp. And if you go when it's crowded, there are people coming down while you're going up and vice versa.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it's a fairly strenuous climb as it is, and if it were more crowded and hotter and more people coming down, I think it would have been gone from difficult to really, really unpleasant. There are some places that it really pays to go with a high-class company that's gonna take care of you, and that's one of them.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of go off topic here a little bit. I did actually want to ask you if you had advice for people that were, young scientists that are trying to climb this career ladder, corporate ladder, if you will. What you would say to them, almost like if you were transported back when you were still starting. It seems like you're very satisfied with the career path you have taken, but if there was anything that you wanted to advise to students.
Follow your heart, do what you think is right. If you see something that's interesting, try to pursue it. Listen to other people, but don't necessarily believe them.
I know what you mean.
Be a little bit suspicious of other people. There are people who are just out for their own benefit. Some people are just going to try to use, I don't think this is specifically gender related. Some people are just out for themselves, and you need to look out for yourself and for what's right. And if somebody is trying to screw you one way or the other, somehow get out of their way. And I had a friend, coworker, supervisor for a while who was a disaster area. He did things like trying to force somebody to send a report out on time, even though he knew that the results were wrong. There was a mistake that he had to fix. That was not acceptable. Another time what he did was he told somebody that they had something that was due the day after Thanksgiving weekend. And he said to this person, well, I won't be here, but I've arranged for a secretary to be here with you on Friday, when we, of course, don't work. And this person had the wit to say, I'm sorry, I'm committed that day as well. I will not be here either. But this was just somebody who tried to use other people, not only in inappropriate personal ways, but professionally. I mean, the idea of trying to send something in when you know it's wrong, it's just not going to happen. But he didn't want to be seen as somebody who wasn't delivering on time. And I think that having it correct would have been more important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can agree, spending extra time to do the right thing.
So maybe the message is, keep your professional integrity.
I like this because I get a lot of rosy picture of everything, but, wearing your rose-tinted glasses, and I like that you're able to really pinpoint some of the honest things that people should really know. It's not easy, and it's not always perfect of a journey that you're taking, and it's good to note that there are things that aren't gonna go the way it should.
I mean, stand up for yourself.
It's perfect. It's good advice for anyone.
Yeah.
No matter what their career may be. Well, thank you so much. I have
you're welcome.
maybe one more thing for you.
Okay.
Who's your favorite scientist and why?
I'm probably supposed to say one of the guys that just won the Nobel Prize for lithium-ion batteries, but then
It doesn't have to be them. It doesn't have to be
them. The person who stands out as being a really quiet role model, even though I said she didn't do anything at all for women scientists. When I was at Columbia, it was Professor Wu, who was just plugging away, being a high-class professor, not getting the Nobel Prize, although I think she deserved it as much as Letterman and the other guys who got it for some of the, I think it was for parody about the violation.
So she would be what I would call like a hidden figure, like that movie. I admire that. It's a person that does what she wants, what she's interested in, without any expectation of, getting anything back from.
Well, I mean, she certainly did get recognition. You don't get to be a full professor at Columbia without having gotten some level of recognition.
Professor Wu. We'll have to look her up.
Chen Xing Wu.
I want to thank you really very much for
Oh, you're
taking
welcome.
time